coming up. Yeah, something is coming up.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I think, yes, there we are.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we're good to go.
Okay. No, thank you very much, Doc, and thank you everyone for joining us for this seminar, our Sociology Tuesday seminar. So today we are happy to welcome Dr. Elmon Bandauko from the University of Alberta. So let me quickly introduce our presenter. Dr. Elmon Bandauko is a tenure-track assistant professor of human geography in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Alberta. He's also the director of a research lead of the Informality and African Urbanism Lab. He is an interdisciplinary human geographer and an urban scholar whose research focuses on informality and everyday urbanism, critical urban theory, as well as geographies of precarity. Dr. Bandauko's scholarship critically engages with structural constraints and generative possibilities of informal modes of urban life. His work is published in a number of leading journals, including Dialogues in Human Geography, Urban Geography, Social and Cultural Geography, Environment and Planning, Politics and Space, Annals of American Association of Geographers, Political Geography, Cities, as well as Geoforum, among many other journals. Dr. Bandauko received the 2026 Distinguished Emerging Scholar Award from the African Specialty Group of American Association of Geographers in recognition of his outstanding contributions to African geographical scholarship. So it's quite an honor to have you, Doc, to share your work with us. I think we learned a lot from your work since last year. So we are really honored to have you. So let me hand over to you without further ado.
Thanks for the wonderful introduction, Simba, and welcome everyone. It's good to see a couple of colleagues joining from wherever you are, and I'm looking forward to engage on this theme. The presentation I'm doing today is on Necropolitics of governing urban marginality in Harare and Edmonton. Harare is the capital of Zimbabwe, and Edmonton is a city where I live here in Alberta, in Canada. And this work is really inspired by a recent publication that I did in Geoforum, where I developed the concept of necrospatial containment to understand how necropolitics and everyday urban governance shape the experiences of people living in informal settlements. But in this case, this is a kind of a comparative paper that I'm doing with my colleague, Dr. Joshua Evans, who is also an associate professor here at the University of Alberta. He's also a human geographer, but we're trying to see if we can do a comparative study with respect to how informal settlements in Harare are governed and how homelessness in Edmonton is governed, because we think that there is an opportunity to generate some interesting insights based on those two contexts and the dynamics that we're talking about. But those of you that are not from urban studies, urban geography, planning, and so forth, you may be wondering what exactly is urban marginality. I think it's important that we are on the same page. When we talk about urban marginality, we basically, thinking about, issues of poverty, issues of socio-spatial exclusion. There are people that, in as much as cities create opportunities, but they don't, not everyone benefit in the same way. There are people that, excluded from housing, infrastructure, and other, socio-economic opportunities that are associated with living in cities. And, it's not just an issue of cities in the global south, but also cities in the global north, also struggling with their own challenges when it comes to issues to do with exclusionary housing markets, where you see homelessness, chronic poverty, concentrated, in particular neighborhoods. So urban marginality is largely shaped by structural violence. Like when we think about structural violence, we're looking at administrative structures or institutional frameworks that are not responsive to the needs of vulnerable groups or people that are considered, vulnerable or marginalized, or look at racialized populations. We're talking about racialized minorities, the unhoused, migrant communities, gender and sexual minorities, and people that are living with disabilities. So these are people that are kind of live and work on the margins of cities in terms of experiencing the different dimensions of exclusion, social, economic, political, and so forth. So the context in which my work is situated, we even want to, when you want to think about it from a global perspective, from a regional perspective, but even also from a local perspective, is that cities are experiencing deepening inequalities and rising poverty. I think we all know that whatever we see, if you go to cities in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and so forth, we see some of these things manifesting in the form of slums and informal settlements, people struggling with multiple deprivation, tenure insecurity, lack of basic services, exclusion from decision making and urban governance processes, high vulnerability to climate change because of where they live. They don't have access to resilient infrastructure and so forth. And there's also a global housing crisis that we currently have. I think I was part of the team that was involved in the 2026 UN Habitat World Cities report, which was looking at the global housing crisis in terms of the current trends and what policy interventions can be designed. It's really a big problem where you have millions and millions of people that do not have access to decent housing, and people resort to living in slums and informal settlements, being exposed to different types of vulnerabilities. We have homelessness, which is a big problem, particularly in North America, Canada included, and the US and different cities, because of the financialization of housing not being treated as a social good, housing being treated as something that must be provided exclusively by the market. So you begin to have some of these different things, and emergency shelters, transitional housing as kind of incremental interventions to address some of these challenges, but without really addressing the root causes or the main problem of what is creating that problem, or the structural challenges. But there are also limited studies that have kind of examined the biopolitical and necropolitical interventions in how they shape governance of informal settlement and homelessness. There is a ongoing debate in urban studies and geography and in this idea of comparative urbanism. And some people have argued that you can't compare oranges and apples, but some of those perspectives are being challenged, and we are beginning to see comparative urban studies emerging from, let's say, France and versus a city in Indonesia or a city in Brazil and so forth, and kind of building that kind of transnational urban theory and understanding how some of these different dynamics can be similar, but also can also be different depending on the social, economic, and political context in which some of those studies are taking place. So this is just a picture, two completely different contexts, but with their own challenges. You have, people living in slums. You can see the type of infrastructure, but also you see a protest of people, talking about the homelessness crisis or the housing affordability crisis, which is a big problem, not just in Canada, but in most parts of the developed countries. Canada, for instance, among the OECD countries, it is the least percentage of social housing in terms of its interventions. That means, if people cannot afford, they are really at a very big disadvantage when it comes to access to decent to decent housing and so forth. So this is really a big problem that we need to think about and at the back of our mind as we engage in this discussion. So in terms of the local context of those two cities, Edmonton and Harare, I think I've said, people may think they're completely different cities. Why do you compare them? How, what are some of the interesting dynamics? But that difference is what makes it very interesting because as you know, Harare is a post-colonial city established in 1890 by the British South Africa Company. A lot of the planning and governance that was at the time of Harare's formation, European planning standards. But, there's a lot of work looking at how some of those, colonial planning instruments are still being used or repackaged in a different way, but the motive remains the same, is that, the anti-informality stance, the anti-urban poor stance, as you see, a lot of demolitions are taking place. Some of the, municipal bylaws are still, framed in a way that kind of stigmatizes people that are living and working in the informal sector. But Edmonton is a kind of, looking at neoliberal entrepreneurial urban governance. I think there's a lot of work that looks at entrepreneurial urban governance. Right, everything has to be provided by the market forces. We have to think about competitiveness. So when you have that kind of context, like where everything has to be provided by the market, that's where the problem becomes, because there's limited appetite to invest in social housing. But Harare, as you all know, like the urban planning frameworks are sometimes weaker, often politicized because of patronage systems and so forth. But here there's a kind of a very strong planning system that is often anchored in, protecting property rights and, and things like tent encampments, like encampments by the homeless or the unhoused, are really not tolerated by the municipal government. In terms of fiscal, we have differences in fiscal capacity. Obviously, Edmonton has a relatively strong fiscal capacity to invest in basic infrastructure compared to Harare. So you see, and Harare is, we published a paper, I think in 2024, when we're looking at the Harare urban infrastructure crisis across water, sanitation, energy, and so forth, and how the city has been struggling to raise funds and it has, to do with the broader political economic context of our country. But informal settlements are really increasing. Harare, even Zimbabwe generally in the past, informal settlements were not a big deal. They say, no, we don't have, informal settlement, we don't have slums. But I think in the city, there are more than 100 scattered around and usually located on the urban periphery. And kind of joined from the urban framework. And Edmonton, homelessness is a big deal. We have emergency shelters and welfare systems. So that's where the other difference when we talk about social protection between the two cities. Here, the social protection infrastructure is a bit vibrant and still active, but still challenges because not everyone has the same access, or even the support that is kind of given might not be enough for someone to have access to decent housing. So this is interesting, and I think there's an opportunity for us to really do some comparative work there and understand those different dynamics. So, and the big question is why Harare and Edmonton, and why this study? So one of the things we are trying to do in this paper is to kind of provincialize the both African urban crisis and the narratives, and that global north cities are exceptional, to challenge some of these perceptions or some of these assumptions. When you think about, I used to think that, because a city is located in Canada or in the US or in Europe, so everything is fine. But I think some of those things, some of those assumptions I had are being challenged as I live in some of these cities, but as I also do research in some of these cities, you really begin to understand the challenges, the inequalities that people grapple with on an everyday basis. Some of the things that you think are only a problem in the developing countries, you may see them in some of these cities, right? So it's important that we think about, some of these contextual dynamics as we engage in this discussion. So, like I said, this study is inspired by, a paper that I published, I think last year, oh no, this year actually, in Geoforum, necrospatial containment and slow violence in informal Harare informal settlements. What I call necrospatial containment is a mode of governance that has got four critical pillars: infrastructure as a deathscape, and then geographs, like what I call geographies of spatial constriction, and then the perpetual threat of erasure, and then the other one has to do with toxic ecology. So those four conceptual pillars are what forms what I call necrospatial containment, right? Everyday governance, infrastructure neglect, shaping the lived experiences of people in these spaces. And I get inspiration from Bembe, who the concept of necropolitics, and then apply necropolitics to planning, to governance, and issues of infrastructure. So this paper, we're looking at we call it bio, in brackets, bio necropolitics. We're looking at not just looking at the necropolitics of it, but also looking at the biopolitics. So we want to talk about biopolitics from Falcott, which is just a mode of power and governance that seeks to manage and optimize life processes through issues like regulation, surveillance, and control. So when you do informal settlement upgrading, or when you do interventions to formalize, let's say, street trading, for example, those are some of the kind of biopolitical interventions we're talking about, because you want to be able to survey, you want to be able to control the movement of people or the movement of populations. And then necropolitics, it is a governance process or governance mode. We are talking about the production of zones of disadvantage, where certain populations are rendered disposable because of who they are, because of where they live. So we're saying it is fine for a particular or a certain group of people to die. And so when we're looking at necropolitics, it is basically about how urban precarity is enacted on people that are structurally marginalized. And this is usually done by authorities of power through enforcement, or sometimes wishful lack of interventions or withdrawal of interventions. Some of those could be what other scholars have called violent inaction. So inaction can be violent. We talk about infrastructure violence. If you don't do anything, that can be really problematic, because it can create conditions that continue to expose and really limit opportunities for socio-economic mobility for particular people. So when you look at biopolitics and necropolitics, sometimes they do operate simultaneously. It's not like in this one can operate this way and then the other one can operate. It can happen simultaneously, as I will demonstrate later on. We're talking about the model of what we call palliative governance. So biopolitics is basically about the protection of lives, but necropolitics, we're creating what Mbembe called death wells, right? Where some populations die while others live. And we have to think about this in terms of the inequalities that I've talked about. There are people who live in gated communities with access to everything that they need, but there are people who live in slums and informal settlements. And some of these slums and informal settlements were created by the state-sanctioned informality. And then people were just dumped there, and then the state doesn't provide the basic infrastructure and services. So these are just the pillars that I was talking about when it comes to the necrospatial containment, the paper that I was talking to. So I want to move to some of the themes that we're coming up with in terms of understanding the governing of urban marginality using informal settlements in Harare and homelessness and emergency shelters in Edmonton. The first theme is what we call governing through spatial causality So when you think about incarceration, you think about a traditional, prison. But here we're not just talking about the traditional prison. We are talking about the logics and logistics of the punitive state. You're housing people. Putting people in spaces where they don't have freedom, where sometimes it's really difficult for them to maneuver and understand or get an opportunity to move from point A to point B when it comes to economic or social mobility. So it is the intentional confinement of populations whose visibility and mobility in public spaces might be considered undesirable or a nuisance. So when you take people, they are unhoused from the street and put them in emergency shelters, some of these emergency shelters or transitional housing facilities are crowded and so forth. You want to say, we want to control how we want to control kind of this population so that they don't create a negative image of the city. So in the context of informal settlements, this is what a feeling of entrapment, sometimes chronic waiting. For instance, I've done some work in Hopli is another one of the largest informal settlements in Harare, which was created in soon after Operation Murambachina, Operation Drive Out Filthy in 2005 as a holding camp initially. But then it has developed into a fully fledged, neighborhood, but with limited access to basic infrastructure, tenure and security, and so forth. There's also the issue of violent political economy through the specialization of containment and punishment. So homelessness in Edmonton can also be understood through spatial carcerality, which is about enclosed warehousing or creating zones of exception where undesirable populations, undesirable in quotes, are kept or confined under conditions of precarity. So it's important that we understand that what we mean by spatial carcerality, which is also related to this idea of what I call geographies of spatial constriction. One of the pillars of this necro-spatial containment that I developed. So it's about confinement in conditions that perpetuate or amplify marginalization. It's about what others have called everyday carcerality. You are in a prison, although you can move in and out. It's what I describe it as open incarceration, because of the suffering, because of the deprivation that you experience, because of the limited opportunities that kind of constrain your ability to move from point A to point B. Stigmatization is a big issue, not just of informal settlements, but also homeless, the unhoused people, highly stigmatized as a nuisance. And if you look at, even in Edmonton, some of the places where emergency shelters are kind of concentrated, they are really concentrated in stigmatized urban districts. You are kind of caged under conditions of what others have called conditions of bare life. So if you look at the courts in blue there, it's a verbatim from a participant. I think it's Hopefully, yeah, it's in Hopefully, like where someone says living here feels like being trapped in a very small box. It is not just physical confinement. It is a sense of being trapped in a space that offers no possibility of escape or improvement. I think you can see that when we're talking about geographies of spatial. You are constricted because, which really makes you feel like you are not going anywhere, although you can move in and out of your settlement. But your prospects for mobility in terms of progress of your life are kind of constrained. We published a paper, I think in 2022, we were looking at some of these experiences. The experience of being trapped. Are you trapped? Are you not trapped? Like, we want people to understand, to give us what they think about their lives, about their community, about their settlement, in terms of how it shapes their everyday experience. So And then this is another quotation, I think, from Hopla again, which, I asked the participant to explain, like, can you describe what it is like living in this community? And they said, I still see this place as a holding camp, right? The way the government treats us is inhumane, as if we are merely being kept here rather than being recognized as citizens with rights and dignity. I understand that, we have also done some work where we try to present or to explore the positives or the positive narratives of living in informal settlements. But also, sometimes we also need to actually bring out some of these dynamics in terms of their experiences. The other thing is what we call, what we describe as palliative governance and the necropolitics of care. In Shona, let me briefly, talk about, in Shona, where there's a phrase called "kuruma ojifuridzira," which means when we're talking about palliative governance, we are simply, maybe giving, you painkillers, so that the pain stop, but we are not really targeting the root cause or the structural challenges that these people are facing. We're not addressing the structural challenges. We're just, we are just doing the bare minimum to make sure that people, at least there's survivability. So an example is what happened during Operation Monapachina, when people's houses were destroyed, in different places. And then the government said, you know what, we're going to come up with another program, or they called Operation Karkai, Operation Live Well, right? And you take people, you displace them, but you say, oh, we're gonna make sure you live here as as part of the government program. But then it becomes part of state engineered necropolitics, because you are just kind of in course dumped with minimum support and there's also limited infrastructure investment there. So what happens with palliative governance is that the government or the state is compassionate. It exercises care in relation to someone who is experiencing deprivation and suffering, and the government is neither willing to let die or nor willing to fully care for. So this is what happens with even emergency shelters. It's just an issue of care and punishment through control. So there's those two things operating at one. And then the other important theme is what we call the necropolitics of erasure and dispossession. The necropolitics of erasure and dispossession is common in both Edmonton and Harare, because remember I said informal settlements, informal settlement residents ensure tenure and security, and therefore they are vulnerable to evictions and demolitions, sometimes demolitions and evictions without alternatives. I think we have all been following what is happening in Stone Ridge, for instance. And some of the people who live in these spaces have experienced multiple forced displacements, which have kind of created a chronic trauma because of that history of forced evictions across the city. So your continued existence is largely influenced by political experience sometimes. In Edmonton, it's the same thing. Sit bylaw do not allow people to set up encampment tents on public land. So the enforcement of these bylaws sometimes really involves a lot of violent displacement by the police. So you look at some of those statistics, you may think that, 2,100 camps, it's just a big number in a city that that prides itself as a successful, a progressive city. That's a big number for encampments, and that shows you the reality of the housing crisis in this city, and how people that experience housing crisis. And allow me to borrow from my colleagues, Dr. Bany and Dr. Matamanda, who recently published something in a paper, a very interesting paper, on how people feel homeless in their homeland, which is really about these displacements and the necropolitics around it. So if you think about informality, informal settlements, the quick conclusion is that people living in informal settlements, at least they have a roof over their head. And then the unhoused or people who live on the streets are kind of, the most vulnerable. But look, what I said, because there's perpetual threat of erasure, because of the tenure insecurity, of the chronic trauma of people that have experienced multiple displacements. So when you think about homelessness in the context of Harare, it is not just about lacking a house, but it is being governed through the threat of losing one or never fully securing the right to dwell in the first place. So you don't have, you're always thinking, what if the government comes and destroy my home because of those experiences? So under those conditions, homelessness does not begin only when a person ends up on the streets. So when I think about homelessness in this context, it takes the form of hidden homelessness, chronic insecurity, and the permanent possibility of displacement. So the fear of being displaced is always hanging around people's everyday life. They're always, you always carry that trauma, you always carry that burden or that uncertainty, and you are not sure of what's going to happen to your house, to your home, and to your livelihoods. So this is just pictures showing you some of the realities. So I want to talk about some of the common dynamics in Harare and Edmonton. Remember I talked about structural violence, structural violence, structural exclusion, marginalization, and so forth. So what is common, what we see here, I think we talk about the colonial logics of dispossession in Harare, like the colonial logics of dispossession, because of the anti-informality narratives that have become part and parcel of the institutional practices, or the part and parcel of the policy and practice in terms of governing and managing our cities. But in Edmonton, there's also, I think it's a big issue in Canadian cities, the settler colonial city, indigenous dispossession. Most of the people that are experiencing homelessness and displacement by the municipality are usually indigenous populations. It's a big and very contested and highly sensitive subject about indigenous people and how dispossession happens. But when we think about Edmonton also, it is also the neoliberal urban governance, housing affordability crisis pushing people into homelessness. Remember I said Canada is the least percentage, I think the only 4% of the housing stock in the country is social housing, compared to the average of 8% in the OECD countries, which is really very, very small. So, and we see in both contexts, the criminalization of poverty and so if you are poor, if you are vulnerable, that is criminalized, and we see even some of the interventions putting people in emergency shelters and so forth. Some of those emergency shelters are highly overcrowded. People don't really have privacy. They don't really have dignity when it comes to how they live. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Evans, have written a lot about homelessness and how it's governed and so forth. So what we see in terms of governing and managing homelessness, what the government is trying to do, or the city authorities are trying to do, is making sure that at least the unhoused survive, but at the same time regulating the working class and maintaining the existing status quo, which is the kind of same logic of what happens in Harare. It's about warehousing unwanted populations where they are left to suffer under conditions of vulnerability. And sometimes, and more often, these people engage in self-provisioning, providing their own infrastructure and services because of that infrastructure neglect, or the state that is not responsive to their needs. They don't wait for the state to come and rescue them. There's a lot of self-provisioning in these communities. But self-provisioning of infrastructure, sometimes it's a double sword, because you are providing infrastructure on your own in terms of sanitation, but if you look at the quality of those infrastructure, sometimes it's poor because people might be relying on pit latrines and shallow wells to get water and so forth. So the necropolitics or the necropolitical trap that you're trying to escape as a community, it's kind of recycling it through your own, it's kind of a double sword when you think about it. So just to conclude, so when you think about informal settlements or emergency shelters or transitional housing, as so to speak, I call them necrospatial places where necropolitics and everyday governance intersect to create conditions of vulnerability. There's what has been described as socially sanctioned dehumanization because it is a result of structural inequalities or structural dynamics that continue to sustain or to create conditions where the state kind of have this hands-off stance, violent inaction. But that violent inaction sometimes has far-reaching consequences when you think about people's everyday life, when you think about their socio-economic mobility. So the makeshift infrastructures, for example, improved pit latrines, plastic shacks, homelessness tents, they kind of express themselves as necropolitical artifacts that create slow death environments, exposing residents to diseases and bodily risks. In the context of Edmonton, for instance, there are a lot of people that have died and from homelessness because the exposure to very extreme weather, which is a big, amplifier of vulnerability. In winter, it can get so deadly, and people don't have where to live. The people that have been, whose legs have been amputated because of that. Sometimes on an annual basis, you can get something like 300 people dying from being unhoused, and that shows how the idea of necropolitics I was talking about. It's not like is it like the provincial government or the federal government doesn't have resources to, and sometimes then it becomes to this idea of what we call necroeconomics, market forces, creating conditions that can lead to slow death. So in both contexts, we see normalization of suffering, we see normalization of life-threatening conditions for people living in informal settlements and for people that are experiencing homelessness. So I want to say thank you so much for coming to listen to my talk. And Simba, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Elmont, for that fascinating talk. I think it resonates quite well with a lot of urban cities, both in the global north and the global south. And I think it's quite refreshing to sort of demystify the idea that this is particular to only cities in the global south. And I find your use of Michel Foucault and Achille Mbembe's ideas around necropolitics and biopolitics quite compelling. And I think you might be aware of what happened in Budiriro 3, where a sewage pool turned into some kind of a mass grave where people were trying to jump and then trapped in, and a diver was brought in to retrieve one body, but ended up retrieving multiple bodies that were inside that kind of neglected infrastructure. So I think it's quite fascinating, and I got myself thinking also about the idea of grievability, and that was introduced to us on which kind of lives are grievable and which kind of lives are ungrievable. And in most cases, the urban poor are always the ones that have got lives that are ungrievable. So let me open this up to colleagues for questions, comments to Elmont. Any questions, any comments for Elmont. Okay, I see Marere. Maybe we can take maybe 2 or 3 questions, then allow you to respond. Go ahead, Marere.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm happy I got to attend this time. Last year, I only saw the advertisement after the presentation. So thank you so much. My question is on the accessibility of doing research in informal settlements. I've worked with informal settlements in Harare specifically before, but through work-related projects, particularly with NGOs, where the communities would feel like NGOs always going to their communities, weaponizing their knowledge, sort of like using them as a source of information to source funding opportunities and stuff like that. So now I'm about to carry out my own personal academic research, and I was wondering if you have any methodology insights or any lessons that you think might be useful for someone looking into carrying out research, academic research on informal settlements in Harare specifically. Thank you.
Should I respond right away, or we wait for other questions?
Yeah, maybe let's take an obvious question and then you respond to both of them.
Okay.
Okay, yes, thank you so much, Elmont. That's a very interesting, work that we are doing there. I really appreciate, the presentation and particularly also the theoretical, orientation, the theoretical innovation. I mean, in terms of application of the concept of biopolitics and necropolitics, I think that is quite interesting, and I think it organically connects with both cities. I mean, Edmonton, Harare, or any other city in the world. So, I mean, in terms of justifying, I don't see any reason for you to worry. I mean, about justifying why you are comparing Edmonton with Harare. In fact, I heard you mentioning transnational urbanism. I mean, I think you should actually think in terms of that idea of planetary urbanism, where, I mean, the whole world is urban in some ways. If you are looking at that concept. Even the oceans are urban. Even the rural areas are urban. Yeah, because we are all connected. So we shouldn't stress too much to think about why you're comparing Edmonton with Harare, because we are part of the whole, the same urban ecosystem, as it were. That idea of planetary urbanism, I think, helps you. You don't have to spend much time trying to justify yourself at all. It's clear. There's no need. But we obviously have to write about it and just maybe frame it around that idea of planetary urbanism. Because everything is urban, in this world. Even the internet cables that are going through the oceans, a ship that is in the ocean, the Strait of Hormuz that is connecting every place to every other place. For me, so that idea, that forecloses any stress around trying to justify yourself. And Simba, the story that you are talking about, the Harare story, you used the term neglected infrastructure. I mean, I would actually use another term, infrastructures of neglect, which you will find in all these cities, whether it's in the global north or global south. I mean, this myth of that the global north is the quality of life is much better and so forth. I mean, if you are poor in the global north, you die. In the global south, you can be poor in Harare, but you will find yourself surviving somehow because of the solidarity economies that are quite strong. Yeah. I was laughing the other day listening to Yoweri Museveni. You are saying fools in Africa, they live long, but fools in Europe, they die young because they are. I feel within a short time, it's winter, they have no protection, they die. But in Africa, they can just knock at a brother's house, move around, go to the rural areas and all that, and then, well, I mean, you see them surviving. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Elmont, I think you can respond, then we'll take the second round of questions.
Yeah, I think this is very interesting. Obvious, thank you for mentioning that I think I like the idea you mentioned about solidarity economies, and I think that's one difference we have when it comes to urban life in that side and ours. There's a lot of solidarity economies that exist in the informal settlements, and that really helps them to navigate the everyday challenges really well. And one of the things when you're talking about transnational urbanism, planetary urbanization, I was just thinking about the paper we recently published in Progress in Human Geography, where we developed the concept of informal infrastructuring, and we used informality and said informality is actually a planetary phenomenon that is shaping how cities. And one of the reviewers was thinking, we really are, trying to, to justify why we think informality is a planetary process. And it's a planetary process that kind of manifests differently depending on where you are, whether you are in Amsterdam, in Harare, or in Sydney. So that's really a good point you mentioned, and transnational urbanism. And I don't have to really say, of course, for journalists, you just have to justify why. But I think the points you mentioned are really very useful. Then for Margaret, I think let me start by saying, acknowledging what you said. Doing research in informal settlements is not easy. Why? Because some of these settlements, especially in Harare, they are highly politically volatile, and some of those the patronage networks are really very active at the grassroots level. And I wouldn't want to say I found it easier to do research there, but what has really worked for me over the years I've been working there is developing very strong alliances with community leaders in those communities, in those neighborhoods. So I've worked in hopefully in Heathcliff Extension, and now I was doing some research recently in Stonebridge. So working with very respected community leaders is very important. Build relations with them so that your entry will be, because what I've seen working, like when I want to go to Hopefully, I first call the community leader there and say, I want to do research. Can you help me mobilizing participants for focus groups and so forth? But and then the other challenge also becomes, it's I know, if you're a student, sometimes it's really difficult to have a budget for participants and try to compensate them for their time. So I've always, when I'm designing or writing a research grant, I always put that participant honorarium in my budget. So when I go there and tell I'm gonna give you maybe $15 for your time. When you come to a focus group. So to them, they don't feel like they're being extracted. It's not, you are trying to neutralize this idea of, this guy is just coming to extract data, he's coming to take advantage of us, and then they don't. And I've also tried my best to use what I call kind of work with the community leaders and say, based on the research we've done, this is what I've done. They may not understand a published article, but I try to provide some summaries, so that I keep connected to them. I don't disappear then maybe after 2 years, after 3 years, say, oh, I'm back again and so forth. So I try to maintain those relations. So it's very important. But there are real risks that you have to be mindful of and how you engage. There are also community protocols. You don't just go there and say, I'm doing research and begin to move from house to house. So community entry points are very critical. Establish those community entry points, have good relations, and I think you'll find it very easy to access and so forth. So that's any more questions from the floor?
Yeah, I think we can take the second round of questions. Maybe as we wait for colleagues. Okay, I see Godfrey here. Go ahead, Godfrey.
Thank you, Elmont. Thank you very much. So I listened to this presentation, very, very interesting, on the idea of necro-spatial politics in Harare. But I wanted to find out if you try to juxtapose the idea of necro-spatial politics in Harare with the idea of raised by Harare on the banality of evil. Because as I was listening to you, it sounded like people are settled in a barrack where there is no opportunity to escape. And even in the barrack, soldiers can, even in war, they have the capacity to escape. Even in prison, they can escape. But the ways in which you emphasized necrospatial politics, how and in what ways these citizens tends to be confined in those spaces and tends to be, if you want to utilize the idea of bare life, where humans have been reduced their humanity and stripped of all the rights. But emphasizing that whole idea, that concept in terms of its practice, not the theoretical part of it, the practice part of it sounded to me that somewhere people are being barracked in Zimbabwe, so to say. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just, before I forget, I just want to respond right away there. Very interesting. Thank you, Godfrey, for that. So, forgive me. I think, I think maybe the emphasis had to do with my passion for this work, and I'm not assuming that when you live in informal settlement, you are kind of, your life ends there. I've also done some work where, really some of the people that have lived there, they have progressed and done, and even within that those communities really trying to improve their lives and so forth. And this whole idea around self-organizing and trying to do things on their own, like solidarity economies, collective organizing, of what happens in places like Headcliff Extension, for instance, in Hopley, where people have come together as a community to contribute without any external intervention, to think about, we need electricity, we need to have water and so forth. How much should each household contribute? So there are really both positives and negatives. It's not like, oh, hope is lost. There are prospects to progress. And I think you talked about the banality of evil and the banal nature of banality of evil and so forth. What I was trying to bring out is I wanted to really showcase how this necropolitics operates on the ground. In as much as there are positives, there are progressive ideas, there are progressive initiatives, there are community-based interventions that are taking place, but it all goes down to some of the things that I was talking about, which are, some of them are intentional, some of them are a result of violent inaction of the state. Issues of dispossession, of course, they are really real, and they can demonstrate how the state can operate when the state doesn't want you to be where you are. So I think these are some of the things I can say. Of course, I appreciate that we need to have a balanced perspective, and I've done some of that in terms of some of my work, really looking at both, not just looking at informal settlements from a perspective of this is the end of it, or this is the end of life, or this is where actually the year is the end. So I think there are more questions coming, so let me end here.
Yeah. I think we start with Regis. I know, I think Godfrey might have a follow-up. Let's start with Regis and then Godfrey, and then we'll come back to Obvious.
Okay, thank you very much, Elmont, for the wonderful presentation. My question is, this necropolitics, can it be applied where we do a study on informal traders who are focusing on the relationship, maybe the relationship of informal traders and the waste management in urban setups? Thank you.
Thanks, Regis. Godfrey, and then Obvious. And then I think, Elmon, you can take the three of those questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Elmon, for the response. So I don't have problems with advancing the necro-spatiality and the necro-economic idea. But I thought maybe in your next paper, you may want, rather than emphasizing on that necro-spatiality and the ways in which you emphasize it, maybe you can bring forth and try to utilize this. Well, I know you know it, the idea of the concept of zoo. And I thought the concept of zoo, which I think Arendt is trying by all means, and as well as Agamben in their emphasis, this idea of zoo that in Shona we can say it, and I thought it was coming very clearly in your extracts that you presented, the ethnographic extract from the field. So without using zoo and bio together as how Arendt is using it and Agamben, then if you just draw on zoo only on another paper, just say, so it's like so I like that. So it's just a thought. It's a comment, not something to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, obvious. And then we will get back to Elmont to respond.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, I'm coming back. I mean, there's a lot to work with. I think this is a big project. I mean, I know a paper for a journal has to be focused, but there are also a lot of other issues to think about, like what my Professor Maringera is saying, to say perhaps, I mean, I think there could be several papers that could come out of this, and there are several ideas. So forgive us when you bring in ideas that are not necessarily true for this paper, but actually, you know, extensions of the paper, you know, for perhaps a second or third or fourth paper, you know. So yeah, I mean, so I wanted to, because I see there's a lot of focus or emphasis on the state. You did mention, you know, this issue of entrepreneurial urbanism and all that. I'm interested more because I think the state, while the state is a concentration of bureaucratic and administrative capital, it's also very important to take note of what private players do in the city and the kind of power they wield, you know, in terms of, you know, necropolitics and biopolitics. A lot of, I mean, if you look at, for example, complaints about the Chinese in Harare, for example, you know, maybe Edmonton does not have a similar situation, but I'm sure there are other private actors, you know, who are investing in urban space in you know, in such ways that they actually wield a lot of power to let die and let live, you know, in those spaces where they invested. So I think, yeah, I understand the focus on the state, but I'm also saying the other side of the coin. Could we also perhaps explore, in addition to the state, the role that these other enter? Sometimes even religious organizations like churches. I mean, for example, if I look at my case studies in Lagos, churches are so powerful that they exercise this necropolitical power in places where they perhaps are establishing their headquarters or they have projects, you know, they have the power to evict people somehow or to force people out one way or another. So that's a form of necropolitics. So not just private capital in the sense of corporations, economic corporations, but also even, you know, religious entities and other entities out there which are private, non-state actors with that power of torsion, of twisting citizens in order to achieve their end. So yeah, that is for me very interesting. Is another layer. And when we are talking about Mbembe and reading Necropolitics, I believe it is also necessary to look at this concept of brutalism. That book, I mean, something very interesting. And I think there are other scholars who have come out and began to write about infrastructural brutalism. And I think, again, back to the example of Buddhism that Simba mentioned, that's an example of obviously infrastructures of neglect, but there's an element of infrastructural brutalism in it, where certain places in the city, through neglect, you know, somehow exercise brutalism on the lives quite brutal. I mean, even the idea of the urban, of the city, I'm sure when you are coming from rural areas, you understand how brutal the urban is, even the city is in general. Yeah, so I think that is quite interesting, you know, another interesting layer, but maybe for a future paper, but I think something worth looking at. Thank you. Oh, by the way, you need to perhaps look at the work of Loic Quaint. I mean, I heard you mentioning urban marginality. I mean, that book, Urban Outcasts, I think is very interesting. Although it's focusing on the banlieues in France, which are also places of neglect in France. I mean, in France, not in Africa. The banlieues are like ghettos, you know, in France. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Very, very good, very interesting reflections from the floor. Regis, I think the concept of necropolitics can be applied anywhere. It depends on how you conceptualize and mobilize it in your research. When you're talking about informal traders and waste management, even when thinking about containment of necrospatial containment, I've talked about. I want to give you an example. Like when the state or the municipality put people in designated vending sites and then they don't provide infrastructure for waste management or and so forth. So it depends on how you mobilize the concept, but it can work everywhere. It can be applied to climate change. It can be applied to infrastructure. It can be applied to a lot of different processes to understand how governance can be used to either sustain life or create conditions that can amplify marginalization. I think Godfrey, thank you for that insight. I think these are some of great ideas for follow-up papers on the concept of the zoo. And obvious, I think that your idea of the state is not the only actor. I think I agree with you. And in some of even in this paper, I think we make mention of private players that are trying to even counter the necropolitical interventions. For example, the Zimbabwe Homeless People's Federation is a community-based organization, very vibrant in terms of engaging with the state and challenging the state to recognize informal settlements and provide infrastructure. So, and working with local NGOs and so forth. So there are interventions that are trying to promote life and improve living conditions. But at the same time, you're right that there's some private actors, for example, the Chinese and so forth, that can actually, intervene in ways that create harm. And then the concept of brutalism, infrastructure brutalism, I think at some point I've been thinking about mobilizing this idea of brutalism and see how infrastructure brutalism works across different contexts. So thank you so much. I think these are great ideas for follow-up papers, and you may be surprised to see one of my papers mobilizing some of these ideas and really engaging with them to kind of understand the complexity of managing marginal urban spaces. Simba, any more questions, or we almost?
Thanks a lot, Elmont. I think we might take the last round, and maybe I'll start with my own, just to pick your brain on two issues. I think the first is around the temporalities. I think that quite radiates within the work that you are presenting. And I think you mentioned quite clearly and several times around the idea of chronic waiting and how it's linked to these issues of temporalities. And I think in many literature that you read, in most cases, people frame this kind of chronic waiting in many cities when it comes to housing provision as administrative kind of backlog. But I just wanted to pick your brain with regards to this. Can we not also see this maybe as a technology of governmentality? And of course, I know you framed it quite interestingly as some kind of structural violence and how these structural inequalities are being reproduced. But can we also think of this maybe as a form of a governmentality, especially by the responsible authorities. And then the other issue that I also wanted to pick your brain on relates to the contradictions when we theorize these emergence kind of houses. I know you frame them quite brutally, maybe as zones of exception, as spaces of bare life. But I think at the same time, we also see, like what you highlighted, that sometimes if someone is homeless and sleeping rough, they might even die because of the excessive weather conditions. So this emergence houses becomes, a space of care, a form of security at the same time, but there's also, constant surveillance that is emerging there, the deprivation of rights, in as much as you can move in and out. So I just wanted to pick your brain with regards to the contradictory nature of these kind of spaces, that in as much as there are zones of exception, or the zoo or the BIOS, the state of exception, but at the same time, we also see that there's an element of social support, forms of security, no matter how precarious they are, but you also find them within these emergence homes, maybe in places such as Edmonton. So I just wanted to pick your brain with regards to that.
Very interesting, Simba. I think I would respond this way. I think I like the idea of temporalities, and it is the focus of one of my papers that I'm currently doing on Stone Ridge, and deploying the concept of slow violence. And this, when we talk about when we think about violence, most people think about violence in this spectacular way. Houses demolished at once and thousands displaced. But this is, sometimes violence that can go unnoticed, that can actually manifest over time or decades through this idea of, let's say, chronic waiting, people waiting to see development, for years. Like people saying, I've been living here for 30 years, but I've not seen any improvement. And that chronic waiting, like you rightly said, it is actually a form or a strategy of governmentality, because what it does is it wields a lot of power on the part of the state to control people in terms of, it's more like, your existence depends on, the mood of the state. So people are always worried if the government changes, what will happen, right? And, if a new leader, a community leader comes in, if a new MP, if a new this and that comes in, what is likely to happen? So it is a mode of governing people by creating conditions of uncertainty, because you then have control, then have, and I think in terms of the contradictions, when you remember when I said a biopolitical and necropolitical interventions can work at the same time, simultaneously. That is where the contradictions are coming in. And I've demonstrated that using this concept of palliative governance and the necropolitics of care. In as much as, people are unhoused, but the government is coming up with emergency shelters, right? To say emergency shelters, kind of act as an infrastructure of care, because where people go when it's become extremely cold, the government is being supportive and so forth. But within those kind of spaces, again, the same spaces, you find excessive control, surveillance, and sometimes rights not really, the right to privacy or the right to have visitors or something like that. So I think there are a lot of different contradictions that are embedded in these interventions that we have to think about, and what do they mean when it comes to governing urban marginality? Because it's some of these things that are operating at the same time, with contradictory intentions, with contradictory outcomes sometimes. So I like that you mentioned some of these things, and it's one of the things we have to make clear in our paper, these contradictions and what they mean when you are theorizing and trying to understand marginality from a different perspective.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Elmont. I think we have come to the end of our seminar today, and I really like to express my gratitude for, making time on your very busy schedule to share your work with us. We learn a lot from your work, and I really like the way in which you fuse in your theoretical kind of density, looking at Agamben, Mbembe, Foucault, and put them in the empirics to really make sense of the issues. I think it's something that many of us struggle to do. So I really appreciate that, and I'm definitely going to invite you again in the future because we learn a lot from your work. And thank you very much, everyone who has joined us today. We will invite you again in the future if you are interested to join us. We sometimes do this on a weekly basis, and if you can share your email, we will definitely put you on the mailing list. And thank you very much for staying up to the end, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the day. Thank you very much, colleagues, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks a lot, Elmont. I really appreciate.
Thank you, Simba, for inviting me, and thanks, colleagues, for very insightful questions and comments.
Thank you, Elmont. We shall connect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and enjoy the rest of your day. For those that might want to have access to our recorded sessions, I think I send the link there. You'll be able to access some of our recorded sessions. I heard there are some people that wanted to attend our previous seminars. Almost all the seminars are recorded, so you'll be able to access them on YouTube. I put the link on the chat, so you'll be able to access all our recorded sessions. So enjoy the rest of your day, colleagues.